Surprise! Welcome to Permission to Flow. So, I teased a little bit in the last episode that things are going to be changing around here. And the big change that's happening in this episode is the new name. So, we are moving away from a way of thinking, and the podcast is now called Permission to Flow. And so I invite you to join me on this little adventure of this rebrand, of this kind of shift in the podcast. And in this episode today, we're going kind of a little bit behind the scenes, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of what went into this name change, this rebrand, and also talk about why the name is now Permission to Flow, and share with you a little bit about what the biggest lesson has been for me around making this change. Now let's dive into today's show. So first off, a big question is, why am I changing the name? And I will tell you, it's a little bit of a story. I actually did not want to change the name. And it's very funny because I will tell you that A Way of Thinking podcast has been a little bit like a child to me. I've been very attached to it, right? Like it's something that's been my own creation. Everything from the name to all the details, all the guests has been things that I've been kind of coming up with and figuring out as I go along. And so when I originally had this idea of changing the name, I had the idea and then I immediately was like, nope, we're not doing that. And so it took a little bit of time for me to really go, okay, would I even consider changing the name? And so over time, I noticed I have a lot of coaches around me, and I'm in different coaching programs, and I kept seeing people changing the name of their podcast and doing a rebrand. And I've been working recently with my coach, Jasmine, who has been really helping me kind of rebrand from a total scheme. And honestly, changing the name of the podcast, I was like, "Ugh, I don't want to do that." Like I was deeply attached to A Way of Thinking as the name of the podcast. And the thing is, when I remember back when I decided to start this podcast, I a way of thinking like kind of just like came to me. Like it just felt so organic. Like it was like kind of like a fever dream, if you will, where I was just like, "Oh, I'm going to start a podcast. Oh, what's the name?" And it just like hit me like A Way of Thinking. And the thing is, like, I love the name. I love A Way of Thinking. And it's so funny because I hear the phrase come up in conversation all the time. Like it was so beautiful to me. And I was very, very attached to it. And so I will tell you, I didn't want to change the name. Like, I'll be completely honest. And so how did we get here? How did we get to today where I'm announcing a new name? Well, what happened was that people kept around me changing their names, and I kept hearing this idea and like thinking about it. And so it was like seeds were being planted. I like to think about that, right? Like a little seed was being planted, and I may have originally decided to dig it up and throw it out, but eventually I started watering that seed, and I started being like, oh, maybe I'm open to the idea. I wanted a name that felt like it really resonated with who I'm speaking to, like what this podcast is about. And to me, it really A Way of Thinking it's interesting. A friend reflected this back to me recently. She said, A Way of Thinking made sense when your podcast was really predominantly interviews, right? Where it was like, here's all these different ways of thinking. But I'm really changing the format of the podcast alongside this name change. And you're going to get a lot more of my insights, a lot more of the thoughts I have around making career changes, and really, I'm going to dive in a little more about that, about what it's going to be about. But yeah, it was like I wanted something that really resonated with everything that I have going on. And that was a big part of why I wanted to rebrand as a whole. Is I felt like I had this podcast, I had my coaching, I had yoga, and there were like these three different things that I didn't really know what to do. Like I kind of built them all in their own silos. And I got to this place where I'm like, how do all the puzzle pieces fit together? And that's what really got me to work with my coach Jasmine. and it's what led me to changing the name. And so I feel like when it came time, I was like, you know what? I want something that feels like it's bringing all those pieces of what I'm doing together. And what happened was I was in London in May, and I was hanging out with a coach friend of mine, Jazz, and a friend of hers, Emma. And we were sitting around, and it was so funny because it was me and Jazz like kind of spitballing for a minute, and Emma was like sitting on the couch, like I thought she was taking a nap. And it was hilarious because I'm telling Jazz like all about what I want this podcast to turn into. And all of a sudden, Emma wakes up, clearly, like, wasn't actually sleeping, but she looks at us and she's like, you need the word flow in there. And I was like, oh, okay. And so, and then we continued kind of spitballing, and all of a sudden, the phrase permission to flow came out of Jazz's mouth. And I was like, it kind of took me back. Like, I was like, oh, that might be it. Like, and I didn't say it at first. Like, we were still like we were just in a conversation, right? And then all of a sudden I was like, that was it. That was it. It's permission to flow. And so it struck me in that, in a similar manner that a way of thinking struck me. Like when I heard it, I was like, oh yes, yes. And then it's funny because I still resisted it after that. I spent a few weeks going like, okay, I have the name. I still don't think I want to change it. And it's hilarious because I was meeting other people's resistance. And I think it's so funny because I think so often I create these podcasts and then it's like I have to relearn the lesson that I just shared with you. And this was a case in point. I just created the episode about other people's opinions and, really tuning into like what is true for me and not letting other people's opinions bombard me. And it's so funny because when I was getting a lot of resistance of people like being like, "Oh, I'm not sure. Are you sure? Really sure about changing the name? Really?" I started feeding into that. Like I started like questioning myself, going like, "I don't know if I should really change this." And what all these thoughts kept coming up. And then I finally started to really kind of ground myself and, and talk to people who are doing similar things to me, as I mentioned in the episode, and started like grounding down like as to my own why. And I was like, why do I want to change the name? And that's the thing, is like that whole ability to kind of bring it all together of really, I don't know, like in many ways, I feel like I'm stepping into the next version of myself at the same time as my podcast is evolving. This podcast is very much, you're watching my evolution through this podcast. I don't know if anyone's noticed that, but I feel that in many ways. Like I think you're actually watching my own transformation through the podcast. And so I think with this name change, it's very much me also stepping into the next version of myself and embracing that. And so I finally came around after a lot of back and forth, and I stopped resisting and I started going, yes, this name feels right. And yes, I'm ready to move into this next chapter. And so this is very much moving into the next chapter of the podcast. And I will say it's very funny. Some people were asking me like, why don't you just start a new podcast? And I will tell you, I don't think that fundamentally anything has like shifted to the point where I'm like, no, I need a brand new podcast. As I said, I very much think that this is opening the next chapter of the podcast. It is an evolution, not like a completely new entity. And I often look at it for myself as like I step into different versions of myself. I think I'm on like Jessica 2.0. Well, now I'm on like Jessica 8.0 or something. And so right now with the podcast, we're stepping into the podcast 2.0 alongside of me moving into that next version of myself. So that's the background of how we came to changing the name of the podcast. And so it's been a little bit of a journey, but I am so thankful to be here right now and to be sharing this with you. So That's a little bit of the behind the scenes. So now that I've given you the little bit of a story of how we got into this rebrand, so let's talk a little bit about the name. All right. So permission to flow. So I shared with you a little bit about Jazz and Emma and I really sitting down and spitballing and coming up with the name permission to flow. And so it was so funny. Like the moment that she said that, when Emma goes, "Oh, it needs to have the word flow," I was like, oh, yes. When I think of the word flow, I think of flow state, creative flow, yoga flow. Like the word flow is such a beautiful, intricate word. And it also just has this expressive like movement, right? Where it's like, how can we flow with things? Like, how do we allow, like, I think of like water and rivers, right? Like having that kind of that flowing movement instead of like those jagged edges or like harshness. And so I see the word flow just felt so right in terms of, as I said, all these puzzle pieces of what I do coming together. And and so flow just felt so right. And so why is it permission to flow? The word permission to me, I think it's so interesting because so many times it's like we're holding ourselves back in many ways, right? Like we're holding ourselves back saying like I need to be this way, I need to look a certain way, live my life by societal standards, by other people's opinions, by all this like outside noise. In terms of really living our lives like according to who we are, it really requires a lot of permission. It requires a lot of us going like I'm allowing myself to be in flow. I'm allowing myself to show up in the way that I want to be who I really am. Permission is it's so hard for us to give ourselves permission to do that. And it's so important, right? And it's interesting because as I over the last few months while this phrase has been sitting in my brain, it's been really inspiring me. Every time I think of the phrase permission to flow, I think of another way in which I need to invite more permission in for myself. There's so many ways in which we need to release a lot of those judgments, those harsh things that needing to be a certain way in order to be liked and allow ourselves to be more of ourselves. And so it's that is what I invite you to do, what I invite my clients to do. It's so much what I'm helping in terms of my coaching, in terms of doing this, everything that I do. I think it's so much of inviting people to give themselves permission to be who they are and not feel like there's something wrong with us. Like we're constantly thinking there's something wrong with me that I'm this way, that I think this way, that I do things this way. And I love this idea of like how can we give ourselves permission to just be who we are and have that freedom. And so that's what I want to be bringing in so much more of into this podcast. And I think another thing that I think is very much like a pillar of everything that I want to be bringing into this world and into this podcast is this ability to embrace change and really go with the flow. That there's another phrase of flow, right? Like go with the flow. Go with the flow of life. I it's like how can we ride the waves of the ups and downs with life? How can we embrace the fact that everything is constantly changing and that learn to like love that, right? We learn to embrace this temporary nature of life instead of resisting it. And so I think that this is kind of the pillar of why this podcast is now permission to flow, right? It's going with the flow, it's being in flow. It's it's just allowing life to flow and not resisting it and really embracing all that is. And so I really want to help and guide everyone a little bit along that journey of embracing life and also like creating more flow, right? Creating a life and building a life that allows you to be in that flow And, whether that's in your career, which is, very much the focus of what I'm trying to help people with, but it's really in all ways, right? Like how you do one thing is how you do everything. And I think it's so important that it's like I may be helping you with your career, but realistically, it's like the lessons that are going to be shared here are going to be pervasive to every element of your life. It is how can you flow with all the different things in your life? How can you create more of a life that is deeply attuned to who you are and allowing you to be more flexible and adaptable with all that is. Yeah, so that is why this podcast is now called Permission to Flow. All right, and now that we've talked a little bit about why I'm changing the name, what the name is really all about, I want to tell you a little bit about like what is the lesson that I've taken from this process of changing the name. And to me, the number one lesson through this process was really giving myself permission to flow. And the word that I've been thinking about a lot in this case is really non-attachment. And, it's like we hold on so tightly to things and it's often out of love, right? Like I was holding on so deeply to the name A Way of Thinking because I loved it, right? And I love this podcast and I love being able to share all my thoughts and ideas through this podcast. And so it was definitely a huge lesson to me about learning to go with my own flow, of letting it evolve with me, allowing it to change and morph and shift over time. And so it's been this really beautiful becoming, I guess, is the thing that I think of. So funny little story is my friends like to say that I am like Taylor Swift in the way that I also have eras. And so and it's kind of true. I feel like there's like distinct like eras in my life, right? Like different eras of different like I could look at it from the job perspective or I can look at it from like different life events perspective, but I've definitely functioned in like eras of my life. And there was like the corporate era, there's the in between era where I did not know what I was going to do, the creating this business era. And so it's funny because this feels like I'm stepping into a new era right now. So as far as the podcast is concerned, as much as it is an evolution, as I mentioned, I feel like we're moving into a different era with the podcast. So previously it was a way of thinking era. Now we're moving into permission to flow era. And so I'm curious myself and very excited to see where this new era takes me. And I don't know if we're going to keep changing the name. Who knows? I have no idea what the future holds. But it's really, to me, it was really important to embrace this change, to embrace the fact that the podcast needed to change with me, right? I needed to embrace the fact that it needed to adapt, and so that's really the thing that has gone into this change, and so I'm so excited for you all to hear. Here's the thing: is ever since I changed the name, I've had ideas like popping off like crazy in my head. And I'm so excited. And I think that that was also a big reason of the change, right? Is like, I could feel like, oh, like I'm hesitating to put forth all the ideas that I had because it didn't feel like it was aligned to what a way of thinking was, but it does feel aligned to what permission to flow is. And so a lot of what is forthcoming is because of this new name change, where it is inspiring me to really step into this next version of me and be able to give you uh, so much more of the thoughts and ideas that have been sitting in my mind that I've been holding back on sharing with you. And so I'm really excited and I really hope that you enjoy this next chapter or this new era of the podcast, which is now Permission to Flow. So thank you so much for listening all the way through the evolution of a way of thinking and into this new evolution of permission to flow. And I invite you to ask yourself, what does it mean to you to give yourself permission to flow? So if you've been enjoying this episode and you want to invite more flow into your career and life, then I invite you to book a free strategy session with me. You can click the link in the description, and I look forward to connecting with you. And I am so excited for you to hear so much more on Permission to Flow podcast, and I will see you in the next one. Want to create more flow in your life? Go to the description below and sign up for the email list. I'll be sharing more insights and strategies with you, just like the ones you heard today. Remember, the power to create the life you desire resides within you, and I'm here to support you every step of the way. The world needs what you will create.